Hello guys, we're going to go ahead and continue on with our nervous system chapter. So we left off talking about the cerebrum, and remember the cerebrum is going to be the majority of your brain, okay, so it's the largest part of the brain. We're also going to maybe get into some of the other areas today as well. Now we talked about how there's different lobes of the brain, and the different lobes, luckily for us, are named after the bones that they are right underneath. Okay, so frontal bone has the frontal lobe right underneath it. Okay, the occipital lobe is right underneath the occipital bone. Okay. We see there are some other specialized areas as well, including the sensory area here in orange. Okay, and then the primary motor area, which is here in the blue. And then we also have the Broca's area. The Broca's area is involved with speech, just to review a little bit from last time. Alright, so sometimes we see these kind of strange looking pictures in textbooks, and sometimes they're shown in like psychology stuff as well. And so what these do, so we see a cross section of a brain, alright? And so this is representing the amount of neurons that you find in these particular locations. So notice we have one for motor, we have one for sensory. So the larger that the part is, okay, the more sensory neurons and more part of that sensory strip it is going to be responsible for. So like you can see the areas where you have your special senses, like your eyes, your nose, your lips, your ability to feel things on your fingers and your hands. Those take up a considerable amount more than, say, like your trunk. Okay, notice how much smaller that area is compared to the actual face here. Okay. Same goes with motor, so we notice that they kind of have similar patterns here. So once again, we see there's a lot of motor neurons on like the face, some in the hands and the fingers, obviously not so much in the trunk and the shoulder. So we see that the areas that have more motor neurons take up more space on this brain cross-section. Okay. The one that is way weirder, but to me I think makes a little more sense, is when we look at the cortical homunculus model. So this very strange looking human being with the abnormally large hands and mouth, okay, basically says that the larger that particular body part is on these models, the larger the sensitivity or the larger the amount of motor neurons there are. Okay, so for example, like your hand, the hands here, the lips, the tongue, the nose, the face, okay, are extremely large, okay, because in the sensory model, there are a lot more senses there, which makes sense because like your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of taste and sight, and then it's kind of hard to see because the picture's a little dark, but you can see the ears are abnormally large here as well because for the sense of being able to hear. Okay. Now on the motor neuron, this one is representing the amount or the density of cutaneous motor receptors, meaning that there's going to be a lot more of those motor neurons in these particular areas. So notice that in the ears, even though they're very large in the sensory because they are a sense mechanism, they're non-existent here in the motor, okay, because there's really not any motor neurons in your ears, okay. Around your ears, yes, in your ears, no, okay. But here we see like a lot of the facial features, okay, are going to be larger here because there's more motor neurons there. Think of all the facial expressions and ability to move your eyes back and forth. Same with the hands, okay? The ability to move these and manipulate environments is what we see here, okay? Kind of just a weird thing that sometimes pops up in weird textbooks. I thought you'd be entertained by it. Oh, cool. Okay. All right, back to your cerebrum here. So that was kind of looking at the sensory and the motor strip. So with your cerebrum is obviously going to have multiple special senses that are not just found within the sensory strip. So one area would be your gustatory area. Now your gustatory is your sense of taste. Okay, so that taste, okay, so your tongue would be like way down here, and the nerves would travel up right about to the middle of the brain, and then that actually connects right here with your sensory strip. Okay. Your visual area is a little bit different. Your visual area, so your eyes are over here. They're going to go through the optic canal along the top of the brainstem, right along the base of the skull, and they're actually your ability to see things is going to be interpreted back here in your occipital lobe or your visual cortex. Okay, so this is why if you sometimes like hit your head really hard, like the back of your head really hard, you will see like black spots or sometimes stars, because you're actually hitting your visual area. So even though a lot of people think because the eyes are on the front of your head, it should be the front of your brain doing the interpretation of that, not so much. And that just deals with how the optic nerve works and how it actually interprets images. Okay. The auditory area, which is what you see in this light purple color, auditory, hearing, okay, which makes sense because your ears are right about there. Okay, so those distinguish what sounds are being made from what. And then your olfactory. Olfactory means sense of smell. And so if you think about it, the nose of our human would be right about where the word olfactory is in this diagram. And that would be where your nerves are. Your nerves would pick up those different chemical messages from smelling either a skunk or chocolate chip cookies, hopefully the second. And then those nerves would go through that holy bone, the cribriform plate. Okay, a little bit of skull parts for you. That cribriform plate has holes in it because that is how the nerves get into this part of the brain. Okay, your cribriform plate and your crista gaiae were side by side. The crista gaiae was the thing that I showed you. If you hit somebody really hard in the nose, it would go up into their brain. That's because right where the mouse is right here is where the crista gaiae would be. Okay, not so good. Now, the interpretation areas of the cerebrum, this would include speech and language region, so we're going to look at the Broca's area and the other language area. Our comprehension for language is actually going to be right in front of the Broca's area, it's right at the beginning of the frontal lobe. Okay. And we're going to look at some other general interpretation areas on the diagram on the next slide. Okay. So we see that, okay, you've got Broca's area here, okay, your language comprehension, so this is the ability to speak. This is your ability to understand what is being said and understand what words you're supposed to use when you're supposed to know them. So like this is a lot of, like if you're interpreting someone speaking Spanish to you, okay, and you understanding what Spanish words are, okay, that would be this part of your brain that's being activated. Now, if you were going to in turn speak back to them in English or in Spanish, either one, this would be the part of the brain that would actually control the speaking aspect. Okay. You see other parts here, so you got your motor strip, your sensory strip. Here we've got our sense of taste, sense of hearing. Okay, the auditory area, we already talked about that. The visual area is back here. And the rest of it that's not specifically pointed out is used for other interpretations as well. But these are the big, I guess, portions of what our brain is doing. So so let's say somebody has either a brain injury or like a brain aneurysm, which is where there is blood on the brain. That's what an aneurysm is. Depending on where that injury or aneurysm is on the brain will depend on what symptoms or side effects that person might have. Okay, so if someone is having a stroke, okay, and that bleeding is happening right here, okay, that person's going to have difficulties with like language and the ability to speak. Okay, as opposed to if someone has a stroke and let's say the bleeding is happening, right, we'll do it olfactory. Right here at the olfactory area, all of a sudden, they'll be able to speak just fine probably, but however their sense of smell will no longer be there. Okay. So, just to kind of give you an idea. Okay. Alright, so layers of the cerebrum. Now, we've gone over this before. Okay, we kind of talked about it with the neurons and how the neurons played a role in this. We see this kind of still continues with our brain too. So when you look at the brain, the outside of it will be like a pinkish gray color, and we refer to that as the gray matter. Okay, it's the outermost layer, and it's composed mostly of neuron cell bodies. Okay, so the cell bodies of our neurons are found along the outside. The white matter is on the inside, and the white matter is going to be the fiber tracts that are inside of the gray matter. Think of your brain almost like a series of like cables and all those like teeny tiny microscopic cables, those are what are going to make the connections, and those are what is going to be allowing your brain to interpret the message it is. Okay? So the fiber tracts, another word for fiber tracts, by the way, is axon. Okay, so the myelinated axons are actually going to be here in the white matter. Because remember from our part 1, the neurons are not straight. They usually curve around, so a lot of times we'll see the cell body is on the outside, the axon curves into the white matter, and then and curves back around, and the dendrites are actually back in the gray matter. So it's almost like they're shaped like a whole bunch of funny looking U's. Okay. Also within the white matter is going to be our main connecting point between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, which we discussed yesterday. And then you can also see the ventricles here, which are just the holes that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid at this point. Okay. Some other things that are sometimes harder to pick out on brain scans, there will be areas of gray matter within the white matter. You can see a really nice one right here in this brain scan. This is called a basal nuclei. A lot of times when we're looking at brain scans, this is going to be one section that has cell bodies that's floating along an area of white matter. A lot of time, as of now, we understand they're important, and they do help with passing messages, but at this time with neuroscience, we don't fully understand the responsibilities of these basal nuclei. You're going to see in this chapter, a lot of the stuff that we're going to be getting into is like brand new stuff, because our nervous system, even though it's incredibly important, is a system that we are probably the least familiar with. Just because anytime you go in to do any type of like surgery on the brain, you have to be very, 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 very careful, because any damage to that brain a lot of times is detrimental, if not fatal, to that human. So we haven't been able to really do a lot of exploring in that particular part of the body. Even on autopsies, the brain is a very flimsy organ, as mentioned in yesterday's lecture. So the brains tend to break down fairly easily compared to the rest of the organs, making them harder to study. Alright, I'll go ahead and introduce this part, and my computer's a little frozen anyway. But the next part that we're going to get into, there we go, is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is the second major region within the brain. So the cerebrum takes up the most. The diencephalon is another region of the brain, and this region you cannot see from the outside. Okay, so to see the diencephalon, you would have to cut a brain in half to be able to see it. And that's because the diencephalon is in the very innermost portion of the brain. Okay. So the diencephalon sits right on top of the brainstem. You can see, here's our brainstem. Okay, this is a cerebellum right here. There's your cerebrum. And this thing highlighted in like the pinks and reds and oranges, that is going to be your diencephalon area. Okay, so it's enclosed by the cerebral hemispheres. As I mentioned, you have to cut the brain in half to be able to see this. And it is made up of 3 parts. You got your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. Okay, so diencephalon, 3 parts: hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the thalamus. And at that point, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop this here. We will get into the details of these 3 parts in our next lesson. Okay, I hope you guys are doing okay. Spring break next week. All right, so if you have any questions, please send me an email. Other than that, have a good one.